Hello everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to create a tearing setup using Vellum grain. We're going to create an object that is able to tear and stick to collisions, and this is a good setup if you need to create jelly type setups that has pieces that needs to be able to break off of it, or flesh-like simulations, any kind of organic matter that needs to kind of tear apart. First tutorial is just going to be the simple sticky setup. In the second one, I'll cover a custom constraint setup to get better connections to begin with. In the third part, we'll cover meshing. And part 4 is going to be a Patreon only tutorial where I show you how I made the organic rock setup. It's a bit closer to a production setup, and in there I've implemented like everything from videos 1, 2, and 3 to create a more production type setup. Okay, I'm starting in a blank Houdini scene, and let's create a basic sticky grain setup. First off, I'll create some geometry, which is going to be our source. And I'll keep it simple for now. We just make a sphere. Set it to polygon. And give it a couple of more subdivisions. And this is what we're going to be making our grains from. So I'll transform this up a little bit in space, like that. Let's move it a bit. And I'll just drop down a mountain. I don't think we get the mountain anymore, we just get an attribute noise. Just so it's a little bit more interesting. Bump up the values a bit. Give it an offset until we get the shape we like. Maybe a blob like that, a bit less. Yeah, I think that's good. And I'll just create a null, call it out. I'll call this source geo. And I'll create a new geo where we're going to create our Vellum setup in. So I'll object merge the source. And I'll just point the object merge to that out node in source geo. I can probably hide the source for now. Let's just call it Vellum setup for now. And I'm also going to need something animated to collide with and to stick to. So I'll create that in a separate geo as well. This one I'll just call collision. And if you go there, I'm just going to create a box. And one's going to act like my ground plane. Put a couple more subdivisions. Squish it down a bit. Make it a bit bigger. 4. And it is intersecting initially, and I don't want that. So I'll get a transform to move it down separately. Like that. And then to add some animation, I'm going to copy this transform. And move it up. And I'll merge these two together afterwards to be one collision geometry. We'll do something like that. And I'll set a keyframe on this, and I'll hold it. I think we're on 24 FPS, so I just want to change that to 5 FPS, and I think about 200 frames is enough for what we're doing. So we've got a key on the first frame, and give it 20 frames before I start animating it. And then we just need to choose how much we want to squish this thing. So after about 50 frames, push this down so it squashes it like almost halfway in. Just key everything there. And I'll hold for a couple of frames. Set a keyframe on that. And then just pull back up. Maybe go even higher than we started. Yeah, something like that. Maybe even a little bit more so we get a lot of stretch. Just set this to real-time playback as well in the timeline. Hit play again, see what it does. Pushes down, pulls back up. Okay, this should be some good animation to test with. This can always be adjusted later on. And now let's merge these two together. Get a trail stop because we want some velocity on this because it is moving. And it's already, let's just set it to compute velocity and set it to center difference. And this should be good for the collision geometry. So I can just create a null, pull it out. And we've got everything we need to make our grain setup. Guess one other thing we can do is let's give this color. Obviously not essential. Helps with the visualization sometimes. What color do I want to make this? Let's go for this teal color. Okay, and I'll go back into the Vellum setup now. And I'm going to object merge that in as well. This is going to be source. This will be collision. Deleted it by mistake. I just need to point this to that collision object instead. Now we're ready to create some grain, so I'll get a Vellum configure grain node. Drop that down and plug the source into that. And it does nothing by default because you can create your own points and plug it in there. But in this case, I'll just create some points from the volume. And I want to jiffer it because I don't want that regular pattern. And I'll give ourselves a little bit more resolution, but I want to still keep it fairly low res, just so it runs nice and fast. Then we also need some constraints between the grains if we want this to behave like a soft body type object. So I'll get a Vellum constraint sub. And this one will configure to create some glue constraints between the points. So I'll pick glue from that. And it's going to be point based. And let's see what else we need to set up. I think it's already creating connections between itself. Put that wireframe to confirm. And we can see a couple of connections there. But it's only setting up one connection per point. So I'll bump that up to 5. I think it makes a difference if we set the search points to 5 as well. I'll leave the radius to 0.1 for now. It looks like it's making enough connections. And then this is going to be the constraint that we want to break apart. But I'm not going to turn that on just yet. I just want to make sure everything's working. Whoops. Undo. And equally for the grains as well, I'm just going to leave their settings at default for now as well. Now we could use the Vellum sub, like the subsolver, Vellum subsolver, this one. But for grains, I prefer to use, grains I prefer to create my own one because this one doesn't give you all the grain settings. Now, we can plug in our collision as well. Let's just see that this is working. Hit play. Points are staying together. They're not sticking to anything yet. We've got one that doesn't have connections. We can clean that up later, and it's looking a little bit jittery in places. But like I said, I'm going to create a DOP and a couple of nulls. And just move this to one side. And just go here. On and call for collision. And do something like this. And like I said, if you go over to, I think if you go to the advanced tab, you get a couple of grain settings, but that's not all the grain settings available to us. And I prefer to have all the settings. So here I'll create a Vellum solver. And we don't need a Vellum source, we just need a Vellum object because we can source directly from the object for this setup. So the object, we just point to that geometry we created for the null, and the constraints point to con. To match the defaults of the Vellum solver, the sub-based one, we'll put down some gravity. I'll get a pop drag, stick that into pre-solve and set it to 0.1. So we have a little bit of drag in our simulation as well. And we need to set up our collision object. So I'll create a merge and create a static object. And the static object, I'll set to be deforming. We can set it to reevaluate subframes. And the sub path will point to that collision null. And we can set the object path just to point to the object. Then it's set to use defaults, but just to be explicit, I'll set it to be a surface collision just to make sure that the grains are using that surface as a collision object and it's not trying to do a volume collision, slowing things down. Okay, so this should work the same. I do want some more substeps though. I'll set this to 4 as our default for grain. So see if that solves a little bit better. See if we can get some of the jittering out. Hit play. And now we see it's taking off and ignoring gravity completely. Now we should get the same result if we set this one to 4 as well. Let's set that to 4 and see what happens. Again, you see we get simulation taking off. The reason that's happening is a lot of these points are still overlapping, even though we've tried to scatter points that are separate. And to help fix that, we turn on adjust radiuses to fix overlap. And you'll see the points shrink down slightly. That'll give us a slightly better result. It changes the p-scale slightly. It just means that Vellum isn't trying to solve constraints between overlapping points. At this point, it's probably a good idea to get some Vellum IOs to import the geometry as well. Or actually not the IO, we'll use the IO for caching. But we need some DOP imports. And in fact, I'll go for a .io instead. Copy those. One's going to be for geo, and the other one's going to be for the constraints. But a manual setup, but we'll get to simulating in a moment. Click that, and I want the Vellum object. And we can do the same on this one. And I want to point this is going to be particles, and this is also going to be particles. But on this one, I want it to be constraint geometry. Let's set up display on that, and we can see we're getting our constraints in, and we're getting our particles in. Now, if we hit play again, everything's still working and we're getting everything imported. I'll jump back into the simulation now, because the next thing we want to add is we want some attached constraints. I'll get a Vellum constraints node. And this one I'm doing in the DOP because we want our points to be stuck to these objects every frame and match the animation. I'll set this to each frame. You can set it to each sub-step, but to have it run a bit quicker, try and use each frame. And the type of constraint I want is attached to geometry. And for our Vellum points, it's going to be points, and then the target geometry can be primitives. And then I need to point it to that same collision path. Just call. And I want to set up a max distance. And this max distance, I don't want the points to jump and get stuck to it. So I want to set it as close to the p-scale as I possibly can and have it work. So our p-scale is around 0.036. So let's just start this at 0.04. And I'll leave the stiffness values to default by now. This one can also be broken, but we don't want to break this one. But let's set up the breaking settings on this glue constraint as well, because that's what's going to give us the tearing effect. So if I select this glue constraint now and go down to breaking, I can turn that on. And this threshold value depends on what type of breaking you use. You can use stretch stress, which gives you which breaks based on a stress value on the points or on that constraint. So it's like how much stretch the primitive's on. If it's got enough stress, it's going to break. Then you got stretch distance and stretch ratio. Stretch distance gives you a physical distance. If a constraint gets longer than a certain length, it'll break. So it's probably the easiest one to understand. And ratio, if I remember correctly, is similar to that, but it looks at the difference between the rest length and the length. For this, I'm going to use stretch length because it's pretty easy to control, or stretch distance, I mean, because it's nice and easy to control. And if I select the constraint and I go to primitive, I can see how long the rest length is. So you can see the rest length is 0.09, more or less, for the longest ones. At 0.1, it should break pretty easily. So let's set it at 0.15 and dive into our simulation. I want to turn on the attach to geometry visualization so we can see if that's working. And I want to see our stitch constraints. Let's hit play on this, see what happens. I'm not sure if our points are sticking. Maybe the visualization is just a bit small. Okay, so they're definitely sticking. That's good. Let's see if we get any breakage. We get a couple breaking by the end, so that's cool. Okay, I'll zoom out a bit. And you can see we get this interesting tearing shape. A couple of them fall off because all their constraints break. But there's some interesting stuff happening. It's a little bit snappy and a bit poppy. But that stuff gets better as you increase the resolution, and also if you want to control the look of the material, you need to play with the values in damping. And let's see if I go into this glue, you play with the stiffness and the damping. The nice thing with using distance is you can have a fairly low stiffness, so you don't get that high stretch stress values, but you can still break by distance. That's why for the most part I've been using this one, but stretch stress is a nice way to break them as well. Okay, maybe we can reduce this value a little bit more to get a bit more breaking. Jump back. Let's just play through this one more time. Okay, that one finished, and now it's actually tearing all the way through, which again, it makes sense because we lowered that value. Sometimes it's a bit easier to look at the actual constraints so we can see what's happening. And that's the basics of the setup. And I think let's just dive inside there. And if I zoom in through this collision object, you can see these are our points that are sticking. And these are our attached constraints showing up in blue. Okay, so that's cool and the whole setup is working, but we want to be able to control where it breaks. And the best way to do that is to drive this threshold value with attributes. So we can scale it by attribute, and it's giving us this break threshold scale, which is a pretty long name, so I'm just going to copy that. And I'll get an attribute adjust float. And I'm going to use some noise to control where this breaks. So I'll plug that in between the grains and the constraints and create this attribute on points. And I'm just going to visualize the attribute as well. And I'm going to set this to be a noise. And I just want to set my display over there so we can see our noise. So that's the size of our noise. I'm going to pull this down so we can see a bit more. I'll leave the value between 0 and 1 for now. And let's give it some sort of a random offset, maybe around like 15 or something. And I think this scale can be reduced. So I'll go to 0.4 for the noise scale, so we get a bit more breakup in there. And the red ones are gonna break more, or not gonna break as easy, and the purple and blue ones are gonna break more easily. I also want to stretch out that noise a little bit, so I'll scale it a bit in Y. We can get some nice elongated tears in there. And that should do it for our break scale. And let's run one more low-res simulation and see if that works. Okay, that has now finished and it's looking pretty interesting, the shape we're getting. Pretty happy with that. I'm going to use an attribute transfer just so we can look at the constraints but also get that display from that tearing value that we created, which is that break threshold scale. And if we scrub backwards on this, maybe just rotate around, it's still a little bit hard to see, but you can see if we go up, places where it's tending to break first is all these purple areas, and the red ones kind of stay together. So that's cool, and that's working. I'm pretty happy with that. I think let's do a very high-res simulation out and see how we can control that. Now that we have our low-res simulation we're happy with, I'm going to jump straight to a high-res simulation and tweak a couple of settings. just so we can see how it performs if we bump up the particle count and just see how the look changes as well. I would say if you're messing around with this and trying it out, probably steadily up the resolution and see what happens, and play with some different grain settings in your constraints and your dampening, bumping it all the way up to having almost 200,000 points. Because I have a lot more points, it's going to be a lot heavier, and it's going to be a lot more points pushing down on top of each other because of gravity. It's going to make the sim more unstable. So to get that stability back, I'm going to change a couple of settings. I'm going to make my mass per point really, really light because they're a lot smaller anyway. So I'll go down to 0.005. And we got to remember our radius changed now as well. So we're going to have to adjust our attached constraint inside the DOP. But before we do that, I want to change some of the glue constraint settings as well. I'm going to add an extra constraint per point. Just have more of them stuck to each other initially. And now we've got almost 500,000 attached constraints. The other one was breaking quite a lot, so I'll set this a little bit higher to 1.3. And I'll also boost up the stiffness. Maybe give it a little bit of dampening. I'm going 10 times higher in the stiffness, but I'm also dampening it a little bit more. And hopefully that gives us a cool result. Inside the solver now, our new p-scale is 0.075, so on the attached thread, I'm going to go down to 0.08. Make sure they're connected, but it doesn't connect too easily or from too far of a distance. And on the solver itself, I'm going to bump up some settings. So I'll go to 5 sub-steps and 500 iterations for the constraint iterations, and maybe about 40 smooth iterations as well. And these values are really high, but we have a lot of grains on top of each other, and they're also constrained to each other. And if you see the sim collapsing too much or exploding too much, you need to start bumping up these values to get back to a stable simulation. Because we're also putting a lot of force on it with this type of setup where we're squeezing from the top and the bottom. Okay, and I'm gonna get rid of that. And I'll cache this out and let's see what we get. Okay, so that simulation finished, and I just picked a different angle and did a play blast so we can see what it's doing. And I'll hit play on that, and you can see the purple ones break almost instantly. Like you can see the ones when it drops as well. It's because we set that value to 0. So it makes sense that it's doing that. It might not be exactly what we want. We get a lot of stuff falling and breaking and going a little bit crazy. Now, in the meshing tutorial, I am going to show you how to clean that up a bit. Because most of the time we don't end up with perfect simulations. But overall, I don't think this is too bad. I'm going to mess with the settings one more time, and then I think I'm going to call it a day for this tutorial. Okay, so we can close the play blast now. And what I want to change is, I'm going to go to this and I'll just set this value to 0.1. Just so that our minimum constraints don't just break instantly. And then maybe reduce this back down to 1.2, because it's, and let's just have a look at these constraints and just see what our rest length are. The rest length is 0.026. Maybe let's go all the way down to 1. I don't care that much if it breaks completely. And I'll bump this up to 1.5. I think that'll stop them from breaking instantly. Just trying to do some quick math in my head. I'm probably going to do it wrong. And in the simulation itself, like it doesn't look like there's no cohesion to the actual points. Again, you don't always need that fleshy looking one that I didn't have this on at all. but you can add a little bit of a traction weight. Maybe set it to 5 and maybe a weight of 0.2 to have some of these grains try and stick together even if they're not constrained, to get it a little bit more looking like a fluid. But you're never really going to get like a proper fluid look from this. Like if you want some sort of a fluid, like a liquidy type thing, you'd probably be better off looking at Vellum fluids or something else and not doing grain. Okay, so the previous simulation simulated in almost exactly 5 minutes. I'm just going to override the other one, so give me 5 minutes and I'll be back and we can see what that looks like. Okay, so we've got the new simulation, and if I hit play on that one, you'll see it looks a little bit different to the previous one. For one, we can see our color representations have changed because our lowest values don't go to 0 anymore, so we don't have those purple ones that break instantly. But it still breaks easier in the places we'd expect it to break easier. And this one ran like about 45 seconds, 45 seconds quicker because we have less stuff breaking. We've got some points shooting off, and I'll show you how you can get rid of those if we don't want them after the simulation. But I'm pretty happy with this, and you can see how you can get different results just by playing with the parameters and creating different fall-offs, and it's always going to give you some sort of a cool, fleshy, stretchy type simulation. In the next tutorial, I'll show you how to make some custom constraints, cover a few other tips, and after that, we can look how we mesh this all together. Thanks for watching. Bye. If you want to see more videos like this, or if you just want to support me, go check out my Patreon page or follow me on Vimeo or YouTube. And if you like this video, give it a like. And as always, to all my patrons, thank you very much for your continued support. I can't do this without you guys.